3 days. In the biting alpine air of Auden, Colorado, 3 days without food was a different kind of eternity. Hunger was no longer an ache. It was a predator, a hollow, gnawing beast that had taken up residence in his gut. It stalked his waking hours and haunted his fractured sleep, its claws scraping against the walls of his stomach. Jake Barnes felt the beast's victory in the tremor of his hands. At 68, his hands had once been steady enough to field strip a rifle in the dark, to hold a dying comrade, to gently cup his wife's face. Now, they shook with a palsy born of cold and emptiness, barely able to pull the threadbare collar of his M65 field jacket tighter around his neck. The jacket, a relic from a life he no longer recognized, offered more sentiment than warmth. He was tucked into an alleyway between a bookstore and an upscale art gallery, a sliver of forgotten space in a town that sold its picturesque beauty to tourists. They came for the postcard views of the snow-dusted Rockies, for the quaint Main Street with its craft breweries and boutique shops. They never looked in the alleys. To them, the wind was invigorating. To Jake, it was a razor sharpened on glacial peaks, slicing through the worn seams of his clothes and stealing what little heat his body could produce. A dumpster lid slammed shut down the alley, the sharp clang of metal on metal echoing off the brick walls. For a split second, the sound wasn't a dumpster. It was the catastrophic roar of an IED. The air wasn't cold. It was thick with cordite and pulverized dust. The sky wasn't a merciless Colorado sapphire. It was the bleached-out white of a Kandahar sun. He flinched, his body tensing for an impact that had already happened 2 decades ago. The phantom pain in his left leg, the one peppered with shrapnel, flared with a familiar, searing heat. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the image away. Breathe, Barnes. Just breathe. He leaned his head back against the cold brick, the rough texture a grounding anchor to the here and now. Auden, not Afghanistan. An alley, not an ambush. The ghost of the explosion faded, replaced by a gentler memory, the only warmth he had left. Eleanor. Her laugh, a sound like wind, chimes in a summer breeze. The way she'd hum off-key while tending to her garden, her hands covered in rich, dark soil. He could almost smell the lavender she grew by the back porch of their small house, the one on a quiet street with a sprawling oak tree out front. "If you get lost, Jake," she had told him once, her voice a soft anchor in the stormy sea of his mind. "Just find your way back to me." He had tried. After he'd buried her, he'd stood in their empty house. The silence, a suffocating shroud. Her battle with the cancer that had stolen her piece by piece had been his final, unwinnable war. The VA doctors had been too late, their apologies as empty as the prescription bottles on her nightstand. In a final desperate act of love and loyalty to her memory, he did the only thing that made sense. He sold the house, the car, everything. He wrote a single anonymous check for the entire amount to the local animal shelter she had loved so fiercely. Then, he had simply walked away. Not into despair, but into invisibility. It was a strategic retreat. In the alleyways, no one could see the failure in his eyes. No one could offer the pity that felt like acid on his skin. Here, he was just a shape, a shadow. He was nothing. And nothing, he had reasoned, was better than being a man who had lost everything that mattered. His code was simple, the last remnant of a lifetime of discipline. He did not beg. He collected aluminum cans, his daily patrol measured in the weight of crushed metal. He accepted the occasional forgotten coffee a waitress at the diner would leave on an outside table. He survived on the periphery of kindness, never demanding it, never surrendering the final bastion of his dignity. A ranger never begs. But the cold was a relentless enemy. It didn't care about codes or dignity. It was a siege engine, and after 3 days, the walls of his resolve were crumbling. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and the world tilted on its axis. He pressed a trembling palm against the brick to steady himself. The beast in his gut roared. It was no longer a request, it was a command. Survive. His gaze drifted to the end of the alley. Across the street, bathed in the sterile, welcoming glow of fluorescent lights, was the Mountain View Mart. A squat, functional building. It was an oasis in his desolate world. He could see the blurred shapes of people moving inside, their arms full of groceries, their lives full of purpose. They were warm. They were fed. He pushed himself off the wall, his knees threatening to buckle. Each step out of the alley was a monumental effort, a crossing of a line he had drawn for himself long ago. The voice of his father, a stern but fair man, echoed in his mind. A man's got nothing if he ain't got his word in his name, Jacob. The memory of his uniform, the pride he felt wearing the ranger tab on his shoulder, fought against the primal urge clawing its way up his throat. But Eleanor's face floated in his mind's eye, her features etched with worry. She wouldn't want this for him. She wouldn't want him to fade away into nothing, a frozen statue in a forgotten alley. She would want him to fight. He stood at the edge of the curb, the traffic a blur of color and light. The hunger was a physical force now, pushing him forward. His pride, his code, his past, it all felt distant, like stories about another man. There was only the cold, the emptiness, and the bright, warm promise of the store across the street. Taking a shaky breath that plumed like smoke in the frigid air, he stepped off the curb. He didn't run, his body wouldn't allow it. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man walking toward his own execution, or perhaps his salvation. He didn't know which. He reached the glass doors and paused, his reflection, a gaunt stranger staring back at him, hollow eyes, a beard frosted with ice, a ghost in a faded green jacket. He raised a trembling hand and pushed. The electronic chime of the door was the loudest sound in the world. The moment Jake pushed through the door of the Mountain View Mart, the world changed. A blast of warm, recycled air hit him like a physical blow, a stunning, almost painful contrast to the glacial wind outside. It was thick with the smells of civilization, the earthy aroma of brewing coffee, the sweet hint of cinnamon from a display of donuts, the savory promise of roasted chicken turning slowly under a heat lamp at the deli counter. For a man who had subsisted on the scent of brick dust and exhaust fumes, it was an overwhelming sensory assault. He felt a fresh wave of dizziness, his starved body struggling to process the sudden, profound shift in environment. He lowered his head, pulling the brim of his worn beanie down, and forced his legs to move. His first objective was to blend in, to become just another shopper on a cold afternoon. He shuffled down the first aisle, his boots scraping softly on the polished linoleum. Cereal boxes stood in colorful, disciplined rows like soldiers on parade. He kept his eyes down, feigning interest, while his training kicked in, conducting a swift, silent, tactical assessment of the terrain. One cashier, a teenager with earbuds in, was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. At the far end of the store, a man in a red apron, the owner, Jake presumed, was methodically stocking shelves with canned vegetables. The perimeter was clear. There were only two other customers, a woman with a young child near the dairy section and an elderly man studying the frozen pizzas. He moved with a practiced slowness, a ghost drifting through the aisles of plenty. A pyramid of gleaming red apples reminded him of Eleanor's pies. A wall of bread, soft and fresh in their plastic bags, made his mouth water so intensely it was painful. He was a diver in the deep, surrounded by life-giving oxygen he couldn't breathe, a starving man at a banquet he couldn't touch. His mission led him to the back wall, to a wire rack tucked away near the stockroom door. A hand-drawn sign, written in bright orange marker, was clipped to the top. 50% off, must go. This was it. His target. Dented cans, day-old bread, packages with torn labels. The land of the unwanted. He felt a kinship with the items on this rack. He scanned the offerings. A can of cling peaches, a box of oddly flavored crackers, and then he saw it. A can of chicken noodle soup. The label was peeling at the corner, and there was a shallow dent near the rim, but it was perfect. It was the kind of thing Eleanor would have made for him when he was sick. Next to it, a sleeve of saltine crackers, the packaging slightly crushed. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the point of no return. The voice of his father, dead 40 years, but still as clear as a drill sergeant's command, barked in his head. A man's got nothing if he ain't got his name. But the beast in his stomach roared back, a primal, undeniable force that drowned out all other voices. Survive. His hand, numb and clumsy with cold, reached out. The metal of the can was shockingly cold, its weight substantial in his palm. It felt heavier than a can of soup had any right to be. It felt like the weight of his failure. With his other hand, he grabbed the crackers. The crinkle of the plastic sleeve was a gunshot in the quiet store. He froze, his eyes darting around. The teenager was still on his phone. The owner was now wrestling with a box by the dairy case, his back to Jake. No one had seen. With a speed that belied his weariness, he slipped the items into the deep inner pocket of his field jacket. The can settled against his ribs, a cold, hard lump of guilt. He turned, keeping his movements measured, and began the long walk toward the exit. He didn't look at the displays. He didn't look at the other shoppers. He focused on the glass doors, the promise of escape back into the cold anonymity he knew. 10 feet from the door, 5 feet. His hand was almost reaching for the handle. "Hey, pal, hold on a second." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air and stopped him cold. It was the owner, the man in the red apron. Jake froze, his back still to him, a lifetime of combat instincts screaming at him to run, to fight, to disappear. But his body wouldn't obey. There was no fight left. He turned slowly. The owner, a man named Frank, was walking toward him. He wasn't big or threatening, just a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a weary set to his mouth. He looked like he'd done this 100 times before. "Just, let's not make this a thing," Frank said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Just show me what's in your jacket." Shame, hot and absolute, washed over Jake, burning away the last of the cold. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Words were a currency he could no longer afford. Slowly, with the movements of a man confessing to a terrible crime, he reached into his jacket. He pulled out the can of soup and the crackers, placing them on the checkout counter next to a display of chewing gum. The can made a soft, damning thud on the formica. He couldn't look at Frank. He stared at the floor, at the scuffed toes of his own boots, waiting for the yelling, the judgment. It never came. Instead, there was just a long, heavy sigh. "Damn it," Frank muttered, more to himself than to Jake. He picked up the phone behind the counter. His voice was flat, devoid of anger or satisfaction. It was just business. "Yeah, it's Frank down at the Mountain View Mart. I've got a shoplifter here." "Yep, I'll wait." He hung up. The two men stood in silence, separated by the counter and a universe of circumstance. The teenage cashier had finally looked up from his phone, his eyes wide with a detached curiosity. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its lights off. 2 officers entered, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere in the small store. Their movements were professional, economical. One stayed by the door, while the other, a younger man with a calm demeanor, approached the counter. "Frank, what's going on?" the officer asked. "He took these," Frank said, gesturing to the soup and crackers. "Found them in his coat." The officer looked at Jake. He didn't see a ranger or a hero. He saw an old man in a dirty jacket who smelled of the street. He saw a problem to be processed. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back for me," the officer said politely. Jake complied without a word. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. It was a sound of finality, the closing of a door he could never reopen. As the officer gently guided him toward the exit, Jake caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass door. He saw the stooped shoulders, the haunted eyes, the face of a stranger. The cold of the alley had numbed his body, but this shame was a different kind of cold. It was a cold that burned from the inside out, a cold that no amount of warmth could ever touch. The Auden County Courthouse was a monument to faded grandeur. Built in the 1930s from heavy gray stone, its halls echoed with the scuffed footsteps of the desperate and the defeated. The air inside smelled of old paper, floor wax, and a faint, lingering scent of despair. Jake sat at the defendant's table in Courtroom 2B, a small wood-paneled room where justice was dispensed in hurried, 5-minute increments. He felt numb, a passenger in a vehicle he couldn't control. He had spent the night in the county holding cell, a sterile concrete box, where the only warmth came from a single wool blanket that smelled of disinfectant. The indifference of the process was more jarring than any cruelty. He was processed, photographed, and filed away as case number 734B. Another piece of human debris swept up by the system. Now, he sat hunched over, his hands resting on the worn oak table. A young, overworked public defender had spoken to him for all of 90 seconds, her eyes already on the next case file. "Just plead guilty, Mr. Barnes," she'd advised, her voice a monotone. "It's petty theft. Judge will probably give you time served and a small fine. It's the fastest way through." The fastest way through. It sounded like an extraction plan from a mission gone wrong. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Arthur Cromwell presided from behind a massive, elevated bench that made him look more like a king than a public servant. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silvering hair and a face etched with the weary lines of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and was no longer surprised by it. His movements were efficient, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded attention without needing to be raised. He moved through the morning's docket with a road-weary efficiency, a conveyor belt of DUIs, domestic disputes, and petty crimes. Next case, the bailiff droned. The People versus Jacob S. Barnes, docket number 734 BC, charge of petty larceny. At the mention of his name, Jake stood, his knees feeling unsteady. The public defender stood beside him, a folder in her hand. Across the aisle, a young prosecutor, barely older than the recruits Jake used to train, began his brisk, practiced speech. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended at the Mountain View Mart with stolen goods. The store owner has provided a statement, and the defendant did not deny the charge. Given that Mr. 1, Barnes has no fixed address and no employment, the state recommends a sentence of 30 days, with credit for time served and court costs. It was clean, simple, and over in less than a minute. Jake stared at the wood grain on the front of the judge's bench, waiting for the gavel to fall, for the final seal on his disgrace. Judge Cromwell looked down, his gaze sweeping over the file. He had seen this story 1,000 times. An old man down on his luck. A bad choice, born of desperation. He was about to approve the prosecutor's recommendation when his procedural rhythm was broken. Mr. Barnes, he said, his voice flat, please raise your right hand and be sworn. It was a formality, but one he rarely skipped. Jake's public defender nudged him gently. He lifted his right hand, his movements slow and stiff. As his hand rose above the level of the table, a beam of morning light from the courtroom's high arched window sliced across it, and Cromwell saw it. It wasn't just a hand, it was a roadmap of a hard life, calloused, scarred, the knuckles swollen. But on the back of the hand, just below the wrist, was one scar that stood out. It wasn't a clean line from a knife or a jagged mark from an accident. It was a starburst, a puckered silvery shape that seemed almost branded into the skin. Time stopped. The prosecutor's voice faded into a dull hum. The courtroom, the law books, the American flag standing in the corner, it all dissolved. Judge Cromwell was no longer behind a bench in Colorado. He was 28 years old, choking on dust and smoke, the world a cacophony of gunfire and screaming. He was trapped in the mangled, burning carcass of a Humvee. The heat was blistering, melting the dashboard, and his leg was pinned, the bone shattered. He was going to die. Then a shape had appeared at the twisted window, a silhouette against the blinding Afghan sun. A young ranger, his face smeared with soot and grim determination. The ranger had wrenched at the jammed door, yelling words Cromwell couldn't hear over the roar of the flames. When the handle wouldn't budge, the soldier had punched his fist through the hot, buckling metal of the doorframe to get a better grip, tearing his hand open in the process. He'd pulled Cromwell out just seconds before the fuel tank ignited. Cromwell had never seen the man's face clearly, had never learned his full name in the chaos of the medevac. He remembered only two things: the ranger tab on the man's shoulder and the bloodied star-shaped wound on the back of the hand that had saved his life. Cromwell's gaze snapped from Jake's hand to the case file in front of him. His own hand trembled slightly as he flipped open the cover. The intake form was stapled to the top, and there, next to the charge, was the name Barnes, Jacob S. pinned to the back of the report. As per procedure for military personnel, was a photocopy of a dog tag, U.S. Army Rangers. Blood type, APOS. The air left Cromwell's lungs in a silent rush. It was him. The ghost from his past, the man to whom he owed his life, was standing before him as a common thief, accused of stealing a can of soup. Your Honor? The prosecutor prompted, noticing the judge's strange silence. Cromwell blinked, the courtroom snapping back into focus. He looked at Jake, really looked at him for the first time. He saw past the stooped shoulders and the threadbare jacket. He saw the soldier beneath. A cold, unfamiliar fury rose in Cromwell's chest, a fury at the universe, at the system, at himself for almost letting this happen. This court is in recess, he announced, his voice suddenly sharp and cracking with an authority that silenced the room. He slammed the file shut. Counsel will approach the bench. Now. He stood abruptly, his black robe swirling around him, and strode toward the heavy oak door leading to his chambers. He didn't wait for a response. The prosecutor and public defender exchanged a look of utter confusion. The bailiff, a man who had served in this courtroom for 15 years, had never seen the judge act this way. Jake stood alone at the defendant's table, bewildered. He lowered his hand slowly, watching the judge disappear. For the first time since he'd entered the Mountain View Mart, a flicker of something other than shame or resignation sparked within him. It wasn't hope. It was a profound, unsettling confusion. The system, which had been moving with such impersonal, unstoppable momentum, had just shuddered to a halt, and he had no idea why. The heavy oak door to Judge Cromwell's chambers clicked shut, muffling the confused murmur of the courtroom outside. The silence inside was immediate and absolute. For a moment, Arthur Cromwell just stood there, his back to the door, his hands clenched into fists. He took a deep, steadying breath, the air smelling of leather-bound books and stale coffee, and crossed the room to his massive desk. He sank into his high-backed leather chair, the worn material groaning in protest, and stared at the case file as if it were a live grenade. Barnes, Jacob S. The name echoed in the hollow spaces of his memory, chased by the phantom scent of smoke and the image of a star-shaped scar. It couldn't be a coincidence. The universe wasn't that cruel, or that poetic. With a newfound urgency, he turned to his computer. His fingers, usually so measured, flew across the keyboard, entering credentials that granted him access to secure federal databases. He navigated past firewalls and security prompts until he arrived at the digital gateway for the National Archives, the vast, sterile repository of a nation's history and its secrets. He typed in the name Barnes, Jacob S. He added the service number from the dog tag photocopy and hit enter, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The result was instantaneous. A life, digitized and distilled into a narrative of service, began to scroll down his screen. It was like watching a ghost materialize from the ether of bureaucracy. The story began in 1974, with the enlistment of a young man into the United States Army, quickly finding his way into the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. Cromwell watched the timeline of a 30-year career unfold. He saw deployments to the humid jungles of Grenada during Operation Urgent Fury, and the chaotic streets of Panama during Operation Just Cause. He saw a career soldier, a man who had answered the call time and again. Then the timeline jumped to the modern era, to the dust and mountains of Afghanistan. Cromwell's eyes zeroed in on the entries for Operation Enduring Freedom. He saw the commendations first, a combat infantryman badge, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds taken in action, and then he found what he was looking for, a citation that made him stop breathing. It was for the Bronze Star Medal with a V device for valor, awarded for actions in the Kandahar province in 2004. He read the summary, his own memory supplying the terrifying details the clinical language omitted. It described how Staff Sergeant Barnes, after his vehicle was struck by an improvised explosive device, and despite sustaining injuries himself, had extracted a wounded officer from the burning wreckage under direct enemy fire. It stated, in cold official terms, that his disregard for his own safety and unwavering courage were directly responsible for saving the officer's life. A wounded officer. The sterile phrase described him. The frail man in his courtroom wasn't just a vagrant. He was the hero of that citation, the quiet stranger who had punched through burning metal for him. He kept scrolling, his horror and awe growing with each line. The record detailed an honorable discharge in 2005. But the story didn't end there. The entries shifted from the Department of Defense to the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the narrative turned dark. It began with standard medical filings for his combat injuries, then tracked the care for his wife, Eleanor, through her long illness. Cromwell could see their struggle written in a language of copays, referrals, and prescription numbers. Then, in 2014, the notations became clipped and ominous. Appointment missed. Follow-up call unanswered. Mail returned to sender. Finally, he found the digital tombstone, the entry that sealed Jacob Barnes's fate. It was a formal notice, dated the 12th of June, 2015, that read like an epitaph. Subject: Barnes, Jacob S. Action: termination of all benefits, pension, healthcare, disability. Reason: loss of contact, no verifiable permanent address. Status: case closed. Case closed. The 2 words hung on the screen, an indictment of a system that had failed in its most sacred duty. A man's life, his service, his sacrifice, all of it erased by a single administrative keystroke. He had fallen through the cracks, and the safety net designed to catch him hadn't just frayed. It had been deliberately cut. They hadn't lost him. They had discarded him. A profound, sickening shame washed over Cromwell. It was a shame for the country he served, for the very laws he had sworn to uphold. He thought of his own life, this comfortable office, his home in the hills, his family. A life made possible by the man standing in the courtroom next door, a man who had been denied the most basic dignities because he didn't have a mailbox. The confusion he'd felt was gone, burned away by a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't a case anymore. This was a debt, and it was long past due. He grabbed the phone on his desk, his knuckles white. He didn't hesitate. He dialed a number he knew by heart, a direct line that bypassed receptionists and gatekeepers. It rang twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. Flores. Maria. It's Arthur Cromwell. Judge, the voice on the other end, belonging to Maria Flores, head of the Regional Veterans Legal Aid Network, was layered with surprise. To what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you're finally calling to accept my invitation to the charity golf tournament. I've got something better than a golf partner, Cromwell said, his voice low and intense, devoid of its usual judicial calm. I have a client for you. A pro bono case. And as of right now, it's your top priority. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Okay, Maria said slowly, the professional curiosity in her voice sharpening. She sensed the gravity. Who is it? Cromwell looked at the name on the file, the name of the man who had pulled him from the fire. His name is Jacob Barnes, he said. And we are going to fix what's been broken. The courtroom door opened, and Judge Cromwell re-emerged. The 10-minute recess had stretched to nearly 45, and the air in the room was thick with impatient curiosity. When Cromwell took his seat, the detached, almost bored efficiency was gone. In its place was a gravity that hushed the whispers and drew every eye to the bench. He looked directly at Jake, his gaze no longer sweeping over him, but seeing him. Mr. Barnes, he said, his voice clear and firm, resonating through the silent room. This court has been made aware of certain extraordinary circumstances pertaining to your case. The proceedings are hereby stayed pending a full review. A confused sputter came from the prosecutor's table. Your Honor, on what grounds? Cromwell silenced him with a single sharp glance. On the grounds that justice requires it, Counselor. He then turned his attention back to Jake. Furthermore, this court is appointing counsel to represent you. Maria Flores from the Veterans Legal Aid Network will be here shortly. This hearing is adjourned. With a final, decisive rap of his gavel, it was over. The bailiff stepped forward and, with an uncharacteristic gentleness, unlocked Jake's handcuffs. You can wait in the conference room down the hall, sir, he said, the word sir hanging in the air with unexpected weight. Jake was led to a small, windowless room with a flimsy table and a few mismatched chairs. He sat down, his mind a whirlwind. Extraordinary circumstances? Appointing counsel? The system that had been so intent on processing him like a piece of faulty machinery had suddenly jammed. He didn't understand it, and years of hard-earned cynicism warned him not to trust it. Hope was a dangerous currency, one he could no longer afford to trade in. A few minutes later, the door opened and a woman entered. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, dark hair pulled back in a severe but practical bun, and an aura of focused energy. She carried a leather briefcase that looked as battle-tested as she did. Mr. Barnes, she said, extending a hand. Her handshake was firm. My name is Maria Flores. Judge Cromwell asked me to represent you. Jake just stared at her, then at her hand, and slowly shook it. I don't have any money for a lawyer, he said, his voice raspy from disuse. You don't need money, Maria replied, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. She opened her briefcase with a crisp snap. What you need is for someone to listen. I'm here to do that. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. For the first time in years, someone was asking for his story, not his plea. Hesitantly at first, then with a slow, unraveling candor, Jake began to talk. Hundreds of miles away, in a cramped apartment in Denver that smelled of stale coffee and ambition, Sarah Jenkins was chasing a deadline. A freelance journalist, she survived by stringing together small assignments. Her life a patchwork of local news stories and human interest pieces. She was scrolling through a feed of regional Colorado news sites, looking for anything that might spark an idea, when a small headline from a local Auden paper caught her eye. Homeless man arrested for shoplifting at local mart. It was the kind of minor crime story that usually filled space on a slow news day. Normally, she would have scrolled right past it, but something made her click. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs detailing the arrest of a man for stealing a can of soup and some crackers. It was the accompanying photo that made her heart stop. It was a low-resolution shot, likely taken with a cell phone by a bystander, showing an old man in a faded green M65 jacket being led out of the store by a police officer. His head was down, his face obscured by shadow and a wool beanie. But Sarah didn't need to see his face. She knew that jacket. It was the one her Uncle Jake had worn for as long as she could remember, the one he refused to part with. She knew the stoop of his shoulders, a posture of grief she had watched settle upon him after her Aunt Eleanor passed. She had been looking for him for 3 years. After Eleanor's funeral, he had simply vanished. His phone was disconnected, his house sold. She had filed missing person reports, called old army buddies, scoured online databases, all to no avail. He had disappeared as completely as a puff of smoke in the wind. She feared the worst, that he had succumbed to his grief and his demons, alone somewhere in the vastness of the American West. Now, here he was, a mugshot ghost on a tiny local news site. Her hands trembled as she zoomed in on the grainy image. The caption below the photo read, "An unidentified man, later identified as Jacob Barnes, 68, was taken into custody." Jacob Barnes. It was him. A wave of emotions crashed over her relief, so profound it felt like pain, followed by a fierce, protective anger. Her uncle, a man who had faced down enemy fire, a man who had loved his wife with a quiet, unshakable devotion, reduced to a common criminal over a can of soup. "I found you, Uncle Jake," she whispered to the screen, tears blurring the image. Without a second thought, she pushed her current assignment aside. She opened a new browser tab and looked up the bus schedule to Auden. The next one left in 2 hours. She was going to be on it. Maria Flores operated on caffeine and a righteous, slow-burning anger. Her small, cluttered office at the Veterans Legal Aid Network was a command center in a war most people didn't know was being fought. The enemy wasn't a person, it was a system. A vast, labyrinthine bureaucracy of forms, regulations, and institutional inertia that was designed to serve heroes, but often ended up crushing them. The day after meeting Jake, she launched her offensive. Her first call was to the regional VA benefits office. She spent 20 minutes navigating an automated phone tree, a robotic voice cheerfully offering her options that were all dead ends. When she finally reached a human being, a caseworker with a weary, indifferent tone, she hit her first wall. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the voice said after she explained the situation. "The case file for Jacob S. Barnes, service number ending in 224 -1 -9, was closed in 2015. To reopen it, he'll need to submit a new application, Form 21-526-EZ, with proof of address and income." "He doesn't have a proof of address," Maria stated, keeping her voice level. "That's the entire problem. His benefits were terminated because he became homeless. You're asking for the thing he doesn't have in order to fix the problem caused by not having it. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but that's the regulation," the voice replied, unbudging. "He can use a shelter address if he's registered at one." "He isn't," Maria shot back, her patience fraying. "Can you at least pull the file? I need to see the original termination order." "That file is in deep storage. You'll need to submit a Freedom of Information Act request. The turnaround time is currently estimated at 6 to 8 months. Maria hung up the phone, a string of curses dying on her lips. It was the classic bureaucratic catch-22, a perfect circle of logic designed to exhaust and defeat anyone who tried to fight it. 6 to 8 months. Jake could be dead in 6 to 8 months. Her next few days were a blur of similar frustrations. Emails went unanswered. Faxes disappeared into a void. She felt like she was punching a mountain of smoke. In the afternoons, she met with Jake in the small conference room at the courthouse, which Judge Cromwell had quietly made available to them. Their sessions were part counseling, part legal strategy. Jake was guarded, his trust, a fragile thing that had been shattered too many times. But Maria was patient. She didn't push. She just listened. He told her about Eleanor, not as a sob story, but as a simple statement of fact. He described the endless trips to the VA hospital, the lost paperwork, the dismissive doctors who treated his fiercely intelligent wife like a number. He spoke of the day he received the final letter, the one terminating his benefits, a few months after Eleanor was gone. He hadn't fought it. By then, the fight had gone out of him. "What was the point?" he'd said, his voice barely a whisper, staring at his hands on the table. She was gone. The house was just a box full of ghosts. The money. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. Maria wrote everything down. These weren't just the ramblings of a grieving man, they were evidence. They painted a picture of a system that had not just failed, but actively kicked a man when he was down. She was building a case not just for the restoration of benefits, but for the soul of her client. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Judge Cromwell was waging his own quiet war. He couldn't officially intervene, but he could make calls. He spoke to a former law school classmate who was now a deputy director at the VA in Washington, D.C. He didn't mention the case specifically. He just spoke hypothetically about a decorated ranger, a Bronze Star recipient, who had been cast aside by a clerical error. "It's a bad look, John," Cromwell had said into the phone, his voice casual but with an undercurrent of steel. "A really bad look. Especially if a story like that were to, say, find its way to a reporter." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a friendly chat either. It was a carefully placed piece on the chessboard. At the end of the week, Maria's persistence was rewarded not with a breakthrough, but with a formal, official roadblock. An email arrived from a mid-level administrator at the regional VA office. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak, citing half a dozen obscure federal regulations and concluding with a coldly polite restatement of their position. Without a new application and the required documentation, no further action can be taken at this time. Maria stared at the email on her screen, her jaw tight. This was the moment where most people gave up. This was the wall they built to stop people like her. She printed the email. She walked down the hall to the conference room, where Jake was waiting, his face a mask of weary resignation. He looked up as she entered, expecting bad news. She held up the piece of paper. "They sent their official no," she said. Jake's shoulders slumped slightly, a barely perceptible flicker of disappointment. It was the reaction he had expected. But then Maria smiled, a fierce, determined baring of teeth. She crumpled the paper in her fist and tossed it into the small trash can in the corner. "Good," she said, her eyes alight with battle. "Now we can stop being polite. Now we fight." The bus ride from Denver to Auden was a 3-hour journey from the sprawling concrete of the city to the sharp, majestic peaks of the high country. For Sarah Jenkins, it felt like a voyage across a lifetime. She clutched a worn canvas bag on her lap, its contents more precious than gold, a half-empty water bottle, her laptop, and a thick, leather-bound photo album. She found the Auden County Courthouse easily. It was the most imposing building in the small town. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked up the stone steps, her stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he was too far gone? Maria Flores met her in the lobby, having been alerted by a call from a surprisingly helpful court clerk who had been discreetly informed by Judge Cromwell. After a quick, hushed conversation, Maria led Sarah to the small conference room. Jake was sitting at the table, staring at the blank wall. When the door opened, he looked up, his eyes weary. Then he saw Sarah. His entire body went rigid. Recognition warred with disbelief on his face. "Sarah?" he breathed, his voice a dry whisper. It had been 3 years. She was no longer the college kid he remembered. There were new lines of worry and determination around her eyes. She was a woman now. "Uncle Jake," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. She rushed forward, and before he could react, she wrapped her arms around his stiff shoulders. For a moment, he remained frozen, unused to human contact that wasn't procedural or threatening. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his arms came up and returned the embrace. He held on to her as if she were a lifeline, the scent of her shampoo, a startlingly normal human smell in his world of dust and decay. When they finally pulled apart, they just looked at each other, the years of silence hanging between them. "I looked for you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I looked everywhere. There was nothing left to find," he rasped, the shame returning. "You were left," she insisted fiercely. "You were." Later, after Maria had given them some time, Sarah placed the photo album on the table. "I brought this," she said softly. She opened it to the first page, a faded Polaroid of a young smiling Jake in his crisp army dress uniform, his arm around a vibrant Eleanor on their wedding day. Jake stared at the image, his calloused finger tracing the outline of his wife's face. They turned the pages together, a lifetime unfolded in glossy squares and faded color prints. Jake and Eleanor on a fishing trip, holding up a ridiculously small trout. Sarah, as a gap-toothed kid on Jake's shoulders at a 4th of July parade. Eleanor, laughing, covered in flour in their sunlit kitchen. With each photo, another piece of the wall around Jake's heart seemed to crumble. The memories, once too painful to touch, were now being handled with the gentle care of his niece. He started to talk, not just about the pain, but about the good times. He told stories behind the photos, his voice slowly losing its rusty edge. He was reconnecting with the man in the pictures, the man he thought had died with Eleanor. Sarah listened, her journalistic instincts humming beneath her love for her uncle. This wasn't just a family reunion, it was an interview. This was the story. That night, in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, Sarah opened her laptop. She didn't write a story about a homeless man, she wrote about a soldier. She wrote about a devoted husband who had nursed his wife through a devastating illness. She wrote about a man broken by grief and abandoned by the very system he had sworn to defend. She intertwined the cold, hard facts of his military service, which Maria had provided, with the warm human details of his life with Eleanor. It was a story not of pity, but of profound injustice. She worked through the night, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a burning sense of purpose. In the morning, she read it over one last time. It was the most important thing she had ever written. She knew it couldn't just be another local news brief. It needed a bigger platform. She took a deep breath and pulled up the contact information for an editor she knew at a major national online news publication. A long shot, but the only one she had. She attached the article, wrote a short, impassioned email, and hit send. A new front in the war had just been opened. Maria Flores was fighting the battle on the legal ground, armed with regulations and precedent. Judge Cromwell was applying pressure from within the system. But Sarah had just launched an airstrike, aimed directly at the court of public opinion, and they had no idea if it would be a direct hit or a harmless dud. For 48 hours, the only response to Sarah's email was silence. She and Jake fell into a quiet routine. They met at the courthouse conference room, which had become their makeshift headquarters. They talked, looked at old photos, and waited. Maria Flores continued her legal skirmishes, filing motions and official complaints that were met with bureaucratic silence. The hope that had flickered to life was beginning to feel like a cruel trick. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Sarah's phone buzzed, and then it buzzed again and again. She looked down to see a string of notifications from the national news site. Her story had been published. The headline was stark and powerful, written by an editor who understood the story's raw impact. Bronze Star Ranger, who saved a judge's life. Arkansas arrested for stealing a $2 can of soup. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The article didn't just get views, it detonated. It was shared on social media thousands of times within the first hour, spreading from veterans groups to political forums to outraged ordinary citizens. Sarah's carefully woven narrative, combining the heroism of Jake's past with the tragedy of his present, struck a raw nerve in the American psyche. It was a story about everything: forgotten heroes, government failure, and the quiet desperation of a man who had given everything and been left with nothing. By noon, Auden, Colorado, was no longer a quiet mountain town. It was the epicenter of a national news story. A satellite truck from a Denver news station was the first to arrive, parking across from the courthouse. By late afternoon, 2 more had joined it. For Jake, the sudden glare of the spotlight was terrifying. He had spent years cultivating invisibility, and now he felt stripped bare, his private grief and shame put on public display. He retreated further into himself, his conversations with Sarah becoming clipped and strained. The attention wasn't a comfort, it was an assault. The public reaction was a tidal wave, and it flowed in 2 directions. There was an overwhelming surge of support. A GoFundMe page, started by a veterans advocacy group that had picked up the story, raised over $100,000 in a single day. The Mountain View Mart was flooded with angry phone calls, and Frank, the owner, found his face plastered on social media, branded as a villain. He put a handwritten closed sign on his door, bewildered by the storm that had descended upon him for simply following the rules. But there was also a darker, more cynical undercurrent. Anonymous commenters on the article and social media forums picked the story apart. Probably another fake hero looking for a handout. PTSD is just an excuse for bad behavior. What's the other side of the story? The media always leaves things out. Maria Flores printed out some of the more supportive comments and showed them to Jake, thinking it would bolster his spirits. But he just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "They don't know me," he mumbled. "They're just yelling." He was right. The praise felt as hollow and impersonal as the condemnation. The true turning point came not from the media, but from a quiet, unexpected source. An old man wearing a faded 75th Ranger Regiment baseball cap showed up at the courthouse. He didn't talk to the reporters. He just asked the bailiff if he could see Jacob Barnes. When he was led to the conference room, He simply stood in the doorway, looked Jake in the eye, and gave him a slow, respectful nod. "Just wanted to say we don't leave our own behind, brother," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We got your 6." He was the first of many. Over the next day, a quiet pilgrimage began. Veterans from all over the state, some in their 80s, others fresh from recent conflicts, started showing up. They didn't come for interviews or photo ops. They came to sit in the courthouse hallway, a silent, unmovable honor guard. They brought thermoses of coffee and bags of donuts, sharing them with Sarah and Maria. They were a quiet, powerful statement. This man was one of theirs. This, Jake understood. This wasn't the hollow noise of the internet. This was the silent language of brotherhood. He started to emerge from his shell, talking to the men, sharing stories not of combat, but of basic training, of terrible army food, of the simple shared experience of service. The pressure, both public and internal, was now immense. The VA's regional office, which had been so dismissive, was now fielding calls from congressmen and senators. In Washington, D.C., Judge Cromwell's hypothetical conversation with his old law school classmate suddenly seemed prophetic. On Thursday afternoon, Maria Flores received a call. It wasn't from a low-level caseworker. It was from the personal office of the VA's Deputy Director for Western Operations. "Miss Flores," a harried but respectful voice said, "we would like to inform you that the department is conducting an emergency review of Mr. Jacob Barnes's case. We want to resolve this matter as swiftly as possible." Maria hung up the phone and allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The mountain hadn't moved. They had just forced it to acknowledge they were there. It was a small victory, but in a war fought an inch at a time, it felt like a breakthrough. The final court date was less a hearing and more a public spectacle. Courtroom 2B, which had been nearly empty during Jake's first appearance, was now packed to the legal fire limit. The back rows were a sea of reporters and television cameras, their lenses like a firing squad aimed at the front of the room. The middle rows were filled with the silent honor guard of veterans, their baseball caps and crisply folded flags a quiet testament to their purpose. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her presence a steady anchor for Jake. Jake sat at the defendant's table with Maria Flores beside him. He wore a simple, clean, button-down shirt and slacks that a local veterans group had bought for him. He looked different. The weeks of regular meals and the faint, rekindled spark of hope had softened the gaunt, haunted look in his eyes. He still looked weary, but he no longer looked broken. The prosecutor's table was also different. The young, ambitious lawyer from the first hearing was there, but beside him sat a senior deputy district attorney, a woman with a stern face who had clearly been sent to manage the fallout. And in a highly unusual move, a third chair was occupied by a man in a crisp suit who introduced himself as counsel for the Department of Veterans Affairs. When Judge Cromwell entered, a hush fell over the room. He took his seat, his face an unreadable mask of judicial impartiality, but his eyes lingered for a moment on Jake. "We are here to resolve the matter of the people versus Jacob S. Barnes," Cromwell began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Miss Davies," he said, addressing the deputy DA, "does the prosecution have a statement?" The deputy DA stood. She did not look at her notes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and formal. "After a thorough review of the facts and in light of new information regarding the defendant's circumstances, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Barnes with prejudice." The phrase, "with prejudice," was critical. It meant the charges could never be brought again. It was a legal surrender. "The court accepts the motion," Cromwell said. He then turned to the lawyer from the VA. "Does the Department of Veterans Affairs have anything to add?" The lawyer, looking deeply uncomfortable under the glare of a dozen cameras, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the department deeply regrets the administrative errors that led to the wrongful termination of Staff Sergeant Barnes's benefits. We have initiated a full review to ensure such a lapse does not happen again. His benefits, including all back pay, will be fully reinstated, effective immediately." It was a stunning, full-throated capitulation, forced by the harsh light of public opinion. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Cromwell looked from the lawyers to Jake. "In that case, this matter is officially concluded. Mr. Barnes, you are free to go." He struck the gavel once, the sharp crack of wood on wood, sealing the words into the official record. "Dismissed. Gone." But Cromwell wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench, and spoke not as a judge administering law, but as a man bearing witness. "Before this court adjourns," he said, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power, "let the record show that the man who stood before us was not a vagrant or a criminal. He is a decorated hero of this nation. Our systems, the very ones designed to honor his sacrifice, failed him. His presence in this courtroom is not an indictment of his character, but of ours." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We have a duty not to forget. We have a duty to see the unseen wounds and to honor the silent sacrifices. Today, we have been reminded of that duty." He held Jake's gaze for a long, meaningful moment. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, a debt repaid, a circle closed. As Cromwell finished, an old man in the front row of the veterans section, his back ramrod straight, slowly rose to his feet. He didn't applaud. He simply stood in silent respect. Across the aisle, another veteran followed suit, then another and another. In a slow, powerful wave, the entire gallery rose. The reporters, sensing the profound solemnity of the moment, lowered their cameras. The room was filled with a complete and reverent silence, a quiet thunder more powerful than any ovation. Jake sat frozen at the table, overwhelmed. Maria placed a reassuring hand on his arm. He looked out at the sea of faces, strangers, soldiers, his niece all standing for him. Slowly, shakily, he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. For the first time in a decade, Jacob Barnes stood tall. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. A single hot tear traced a path through the weathered lines on his cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, a silent washing away of years of shame and solitude. He had, at last, come in from the cold. 3 months later, the snow in Auden had begun its slow retreat, surrendering the valley floor back to the stubborn green of early spring. The media had moved on, chasing the next fleeting outrage, the next 24-hour news cycle. The town had returned to its quiet rhythm. And for Jacob Barnes, life had begun again. He stood by the large picture window of a small, clean apartment on the second floor of a modest complex reserved for veterans. The GoFundMe donations had been placed in a trust, managed by Maria Flores, but the apartment itself was paid for by the substantial back pay from the VA, a check that had been delivered by a humbled and apologetic official. The apartment wasn't the house he had shared with Eleanor. It didn't have her garden or the sprawling oak tree, but it was his. It was warm, and it was safe. A wet nose nudged his hand. He looked down into the soulful brown eyes of Buddy, a 3-year-old black Labrador retriever. The dog had been a gift from a veteran support foundation, a loyal companion trained to sense the onset of anxiety, to ground him when the ghosts of Kandahar threatened to breach the perimeter of the present. Jake ran his hand over the dog's smooth head. The simple, grounding act, a small miracle. The past few months had not been a fairy tale ending, but a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. There were still bad days. Days when the silence of the apartment felt too loud, when the shadows in the corners looked like crouched figures. But now, he wasn't alone in the fight. He had a weekly therapy session at the local VA clinic, a new, better-funded clinic that had sprung up in the wake of the scandal. He sat in a circle with other veterans, men and women of all ages, and they talked. They didn't just talk about the wars they had fought overseas, but the harder wars they fought within themselves every day. For the first time, he spoke about Eleanor's death, not just as a loss, but as the final mission he had failed. The group didn't offer pity. They offered understanding. They knew the language of loss. His connection with Sarah had become the bedrock of his new life. She had decided to stay in Auden, taking a job at the local paper, which had eagerly hired the journalist who put their small town on the national map. She came over for dinner twice a week, filling his quiet apartment with the scent of her slightly burned cooking and the easy warmth of family. They were healing together, rebuilding the family that had been fractured by grief. The doorbell rang. Buddy let out a soft woof and trotted to the door, his tail wagging. Jake opened it to find Arthur Cromwell standing in the hallway, not in his black judicial robe, but in a simple fleece jacket and jeans, holding a fishing rod. "The trout are biting up at Blue Mesa Reservoir," the judge said with a small smile. "Thought you might be interested." Their friendship was the most unexpected outcome of the whole ordeal. After the trial, Cromwell had approached him, not as a judge, but as the man whose life he had saved. They didn't talk about the fire or the courtroom. They talked about baseball and the weather. They discovered a shared passion for fly fishing. In the quiet solitude of a mountain stream, they found a common ground, Two men bound by a single violent moment in the past, now finding a quiet peace in the present. "Give me 5 minutes," Jake said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. As he went to grab his own fishing gear, his gaze fell on a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the Polaroid from the album, a young Jake and a radiant Eleanor on their wedding day. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer haunted him. They were just memories now, companions on his journey. He picked up the photo, his thumb gently tracing the edge of Eleanor's smiling face. For months after she died, he had felt like a ship cut loose from its moorings, adrift on a dark, endless sea. He wasn't sure he would ever find shore. But he had. It wasn't the shore he had left, but it was land. Solid ground. He looked out the window at the rugged peaks of the Rockies, standing sentinel against the clear blue sky. He thought of the long, cold nights in the alley, the crushing weight of shame in the courtroom. It felt like a story about someone else. "I found my way back, Elle," he whispered to the photograph, his voice steady and clear. "It took a while, but I'm home." Putting the frame back in its place, he grabbed his jacket, gave Buddy a final pat, and walked out the door into the bright, crisp air of the first day of the rest of his life.